thank you all for being here. Welcome. I'm Rachel Lessem, a research scientist from the Leonard Shanfield Research Institute at CJE Senior Life here in Chicago, and I'm so happy you all could join us today. First, some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. Also, for the first time, live transcript is on. If you click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen, you can choose to either view or hide the subtitles. Please stay muted until the Q&A. If questions come up during the presentation, you can put them in the chat box and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. If you have any tech issues that come up, please also put them in the chat box and my colleague, Nikki Briggs, will answer them. There will be an evaluation at the end of the presentation, both in the chat box, and we will send you a follow-up email. If you fill out the evaluation, you will have a chance to win a $25 gift card. So please fill it out for our feedback and for you to win. This webinar is funded by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute as part of their initiative to accelerate tools and resources. So let's get started. We have divided the webinars in this series based on the timeline of a SAGE model board, and we have covered an overview, building, operating, all available on our website. Today is our final webinar, which will be covering evaluating processes and outcomes. During the seminar today, you'll understand the purpose of evaluation materials that we have in our SAGE resources. We'll cover how to use or adapt the SAGE model evaluation tools, identify process questions to assess the sustainability of SAGE model research advisory boards, and identify approaches for evaluating outcomes. What do we mean by engaged research? When we're talking about the SAGE model, we mean working collaboratively with or seeking knowledge from those who have a direct stake in your research to ensure that that research findings are translatable and lead to sustainable solutions to well-recognized problems. If you have been at our previous webinars, this looks familiar to you. If not, just very quickly, what is the SAGE model? It's a standing and ongoing research advisory board comprised of older adults who operate as SAGEs, offering guidance from the expertise of their lived experience receiving long-term services and supports or similar populations. And it's based on a partnership between an academic partner and an LTSS provider in an ongoing reciprocal relationship. Guided by the PCORI principles of engagement, including reciprocal relationships, co-learning, partnership, trust, transparency, and honesty. And in contrast to other methods like community-based participatory research, they're not tied to a single project, but function on an ongoing basis, giving input on multiple projects to multiple researchers with the ultimate goal of engaged research and greater research success. And this is a flexible approach that allows us to say all research can be and should be engaged research, and it's been specifically designed for people who may not be active agers. The goal of the SAGE model is to embed engagement in the heart of the research process. And you can see on this diagram all the different ways and parts of the research process in which the SAGE model can be used to get input. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Rebecca Berman, who is also a research scientist here at the Leonard Shanfield Research Institute. And she's going to walk us through process evaluations for SAGE model boards. Rebecca?
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. There was something going on, so I'm making sure everyone can hear me. Wonderful. So evaluating stakeholder advisory groups, and in fact, evaluating engagement in general is a recognized challenge. Patient and stakeholder engagement is not necessarily consistently defined in the literature, and there are a variety of engagement frameworks, as we noted in our first webinar in this series. And in addition, group structure and process and design can vary by setting, by the population, by the context. So there's some variation in how we should go about doing this. The most common approach is process evaluation, and that makes sense when we're developing advisory boards or groups. It helps us build knowledge about how to implement various approaches and models. We can document outputs, we can have some lessons learned, and even look to emerging outcomes. In webinar 1, we also noted that core principles tend to be more similar across projects and settings and different frameworks. So that can be a productive place to start, looking at those core principles of engagement. Later on in this presentation, Erin McGaffigan will be speaking about one framework for evaluating stakeholder engagement. Next slide, please. So for process evaluation, there's really like 4 key elements to think about. The first is to think about what is the purpose or potential use of your evaluation. The best way to illustrate this is to talk about how we did this for the Bureau of SAGES, which was our original board. And that process happened for over a 2-year process. So for that evaluation, our goal was to monitor the progress of the project and to improve the quality of the engagement of the members that we were working with, and to identify some potential immediate outcomes. Our primary audience was, of course, our funder, PCORI, but also internally, our researchers at CJE Senior Life, so that we would know how to sustain and run this in the future and do a good job. We thought about our stakeholder perspectives and decided to collect information from board members, from researchers who were directly involved in the development of the board, where they did co-learning with the board members, and from researchers who presented to the board and the facilitators who were involved. In our approach, we wanted to do this on an ongoing basis and really heavily incorporate stakeholder feedback loops. We did have anticipated outcomes, and we did develop a logic model, which represents how we conceptualized what we thought we were going to be doing right at the beginning. Next slide, please. So here's our logic model. I'm not going to go into it, but you can see the activities outlined on the left and the potential outcomes on the right. I just want to make a note that this was, we did have a variety of co-learning activities that involved both researchers and members in quarterly retreats. And the members also had their own separate meetings. So just important to note that over the 2 years, we did a lot. So our logic model did inform our evaluation plan, and it included things like pre and post surveys, brief interviews, regular informal feedback, observations, and process notes. We contracted with an external evaluator to do those things, most of those things. Her name was Rebecca Johnson from Northwestern University. And she discovered that along the way, she had to modify some of those data collection strategies. So she created some more structured tools for observation. She added group review and reflection sessions with different groups. So with the members separately from the researchers, separately from the project team. And she found that the surveys that she had planned to use to evaluate the retreats did not work for members. And we'll talk about that in a second. She also decided to use a technique called outcomes harvesting to make sense of the outcomes beyond the original work plan. And she did this by reviewing notes, evaluation data, bureau products, and materials. Next slide, please. So this is one way she adjusted her approach. During the quarterly retreats, there were some co-learning activities that involved both researchers and members together. Initially, she had planned to do a pre and post before and after the retreat, but the retreats were about a half day or a little over, and that became problematic for members because it put the burden of recall on them. And by the end of that 4 to 5 hours, they were really fatigued. So she switched it up and she picked this format, which is called Together at the Table Placemat format. And instead of evaluating the whole retreat, we evaluated each of the activities during the retreat. So this was on a sort of laminated placemat and with Velcro on it. And we would insert the name of the activity on the plate and then use Velcro check marks to answer each of those questions. I felt heard, there was teamwork, I learned something. If there was nothing in the box, that meant no or maybe, or I don't know. And then ask them if they had any other thoughts and wrote down what they had to say. And then ask them overall what they thought of that activity, giving it a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or a thumb sideways. This was done by pairing up researchers or team members with an individual a member of the board. And then when the placemat was complete, we took a photo of it, captured the written thoughts, and gave those to the evaluator for her to analyze later on. That way we could remove all this and go on to the next activity and have it and be able to evaluate that on a real-time basis. Next slide, please. So how should you be evaluating your advisory board process? The process evaluation should align with your goals for stakeholder engagement, and it should fit your setting. So you have to think about, what is the purpose of your evaluation? Is it to determine if the board is operating as you planned? Or is it to improve the implementation process as it develops? Is it to identify what works best for each of the stakeholder groups? Are you going to assess the level of interest, participation, engagement, commitment, satisfaction? Are you going to provide evidence of enactment of those core engagement principles? Thinking about what are the primary purposes of your evaluation. And that is partly contingent on who your audiences are. So of course you have your funder, but you may also have key decision makers at your organization who have a stake in the development of your advisory board. Or there may be decision makers or influencers in organizations that you're partnering with. And then of course, thinking about what you need to learn when, if this is going to be ongoing, do you have a pre and post, things like that, and building in flexibility for your process evaluation plan. Things to take into account that, actors may change, the context may have changing conditions, such as a pandemic, for example. Next slide, please. So how do you use the SAGE model evaluation materials? I want to reiterate that everything we provide is a sample. So we do intend that you should modify or use these things that align, that fit your setting. So this is not a prescriptive package. We have a variety of things available that you'll see on our website. Member surveys include an initial evaluation survey, which can capture baseline attitudes or perceptions, an interim evaluation survey, which can be especially used for quality improvement, and a follow-up evaluation survey that can capture those same attitudes and changes in those attitudes and perceptions. There are a couple of observation templates. There are a lot of different sample questions you can use for debriefing meetings with different stakeholders, and there are researcher surveys. Next slide, please. So this is one example of the different ways that you can modify the response options. So we used a combination of the yes, maybe, no, with the icons down at the bottom for our members of the Bureau of SAGES, but you could turn it into a Likert scale if your members are comfortable with that. You could decide to have a different type of response option, whatever it is that you're looking for that you want to learn. Next slide, please. And then some of our bureaus have chosen to add questions or change the wording of the questions. This comes from the Mesulin Bureau, which was made up of persons recently diagnosed with dementia. And that bureau, they chose to add questions that they felt were really relevant for their population. Next slide, please. And this is just a few sample questions from our researcher surveys. These were intended for researchers who presented to the Bureau of SAGES. So on the left, we have questions that really kind of get a sense of what they're hoping to learn, their level of experience with presenting to this particular population, the older adults receiving long-term services and support. And on the right, we have questions that have more to do with what phase of their project, what kind of feedback they did get, and how they use that. Next slide, please. And just very briefly, there are two different options for ways of taking observational notes. And next slide, please. And there are a variety of tools that can be helpful for asking questions during debriefing sessions. So now I'd like to welcome Jane Straker. I'm so happy you're here. She's the Director of Research at Scripps Gerontology Center at Miami University in Ohio. And she is going to tell us more about her experience with using the SAGE resource materials when evaluating the development of the Van Crest Research Advisory Group. Take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca. And we could go to the next slide. Okay, in order for me to talk a little bit about evaluation, I think it would help to have some context. So I'm going to tell you just a bit about this advisory group. My colleague Katie Abbott and I at Miami created this rural board in a facility. It's in the small town of Van Wert, Ohio, land of cornfields and beans in the northwest part of the state. This long-term care community has an average sized nursing home and a large assisted living facility. When we first approached them about participating in creating a board, their main concern was having enough residents to actually create a board. They said they had trouble even creating a 3 to 4 member active resident council. So after some consultation with CJE, we decided to combine residents from both the nursing home and assisted living into one group. So we had a group of 8 advisory board members. What did we do? Katie and or I were in the facility 4 times. We had an initial meeting with the facilitator, the administrator, and then the residents. We had 2 in-person researcher meetings, and you see in the photo shows our first researcher in this theater room where we held the presentations and meetings. We moved to 2 virtual researcher meetings, and finally we went back again for a debrief meeting with the residents and a debrief meeting with the administrator and the facilitator. The activity director in the nursing home actually played the role of facilitator for the group. Next slide. As the photo shows, and I mentioned earlier, we had a theater set up, and this photo amuses me today because apparently we were doing social distancing even before the pandemic. I do believe that this was a convenient way for the residents to seat themselves, everyone sort of at the end of a row. But what we learned was for the researchers who were attending virtually, there was a camera that was located on the top of the screen in the photo that you saw earlier. The researchers found it was difficult to hear the residents, and the residents found it was difficult to hear the researchers. Most researchers used a few PowerPoint slides to describe their research, and then they focused most of the 1-hour meeting on the discussion. After the first virtual meeting, the residents let us know they wanted to see the researcher's face. And so we made sure that their video was on throughout the meeting, and that we changed the defaults so that their face would fill the screen essentially whenever they were speaking. These virtual meetings were new. This was pre-pandemic. And so I'd love to go back now and see about our aptitude, both the residents, researchers, and everyone involved in making these virtual meetings a little more successful. Next slide, please. So how did we evaluate our program? Basically, we largely used the materials that Rebecca just did a nice job of describing. We used the pre and post-test resident board member surveys. We reported monthly to Rebecca by phone, just a sort of a monthly debrief about how things are going. And she actually observed one of the virtual meetings as well. We also used the observation sheets that she showed you, and we used the question guides for the final qualitative debrief meeting with members. CJE also put their researcher surveys online, and we directed our researcher participants to complete the survey both before and after the meetings with the board. So we basically tried most of the things that were the recommended evaluation materials. Next slide, please. So what did we find useful? The pre-test and post-test with the question options as written were ably completed by the board members. We found some of the comments that they added onto those documents also helpful in helping us understand their motivations about participating. The researcher surveys were also useful. CJE shared comments from some of those back to us, and it also helped us think about how to prepare the researchers for their meetings with the board. The in-person debrief at the end was probably one of the most helpful meetings of all. First, because we had addressed some of those theater setup issues and had moved to a conference room, which allowed everyone to sit around the table in closer proximity, see each other's faces, hear and have more of a discussion together rather than sort of the one-on-one discussion of individual participants with the researcher. The facilitator had been also getting feedback regularly. And so we knew that the space issue was important for us to address. Next slide, please. What wasn't useful? Two things that we used and eventually sort of let go by the wayside. The first were the behavioral observation sheets. They were time consuming to complete, and it felt as though they didn't exactly capture everything that was going on. So I essentially ended up taking just basic notes about the content of the discussion, as well as some particular notes about whose comments or whatever. And so we captured the content more than the how the board was participating. I also tried to keep a journal and a time log of the amount of time that we were spending as an academic liaison to put this board into place and manage it. And like most time tracking things that I've done throughout my career, I eventually end up forgetting about it and just spending the time doing the work rather than tracking the work. Someone else might have better luck with that. And it might also be important to a stakeholder in your organization to just know how much it was taking. Next slide, please. What did we learn? Technology was important. We needed reliable internet. We needed good speakers. We needed microphones for virtual meetings. We did learn that the residents enjoyed their time. They felt valued by being included. The researchers found their input very valuable. And residents did want to know what happened with their input. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. Finally, we learned that the facility and all the members of the facility, the facilitator felt very honored and valued by being included in this kind of project. As they said more than once, we're just little small town people and we don't get asked our opinions on stuff like this very often. So the rural input was of real value here. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, residents often surprised us with their input. More than once, we commented that we would have never considered something that they had suggested. It wasn't easy to recruit researchers to participate. This was a time commitment. It's not something you have to do. We found that all 4 of the researchers that participated had participated in nursing home work, either doing research or clinical practice in their current or previous career. And so I think they were very much comfortable with speaking to residents and also recognizing the input and the value that these residents could provide to the research. This facility created the board as a meaningful resident activity that might lead to some future positive partnerships or other opportunities. But their main interest was having the residents do an activity that was meaningful and enjoyable to them. And all of the board members were pleased to have been involved, but a couple sort of had a been there, done that attitude. And when we came to the final debrief, they thought maybe they weren't that interested in continuing if the opportunity arose. Next slide, please. What would I do going forward? I'd keep doing the pre-tests. I might add the interim questions. I would keep doing the researcher surveys, but I might do some quarterly debriefs with the residents just to say, how are things going? What'd you like? What don't you like? What can we do differently? We'd also want to remember that, as Rebecca pointed out, there are multiple stakeholders with multiple needs, multiple goals for this kind of project and evaluating it. And the different needs need to be considered when you think about sharing output. In the previous slide, I noted that the residents wanted to know what happened to their input. And so going forward, I would build in a feedback loop to get information from the researchers back to the residents. And also perhaps if there are other stakeholders involved, getting resident feedback to the administrator, getting feedback to the researchers about what what they improved and what they learned. It seems like letting all the stakeholders know about the results of the evaluation would be really helpful. Might keep residents energized and interested. It might keep the facility motivated to keep doing this activity and participation. And it would help the academic liaisons regarding the kind of benefits that researchers were seeing from the board's input. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was really helpful. And I think we can all see from Jane's presentation how evaluation leads us into the issue of sustainability, which is something you have to consider for SAGE model boards. There are three roles that need to be sustained. And in order to sustain them, you need to attend to the needs and capacities and barriers of each of these groups fulfilling these roles, which I'm going to go through one by one: researchers, members, and providers. When considering sustainability, you have to face the inevitability of member attrition. Some members may find they have other time constraints that interfere with their time on the board. They may develop other interests, or they may even lose the capacity to participate in a meaningful way. Your best strategy to address this is recruiting new members. And I chose this picture because it seems like the woman is shouting, like in the electric company, "Hey, you guys." And as we mentioned in webinar 2, word of mouth is often your best recruitment strategy. So encourage members to tell their friends and invite them to come to meetings to check it out. And this is the most common way that we have added new members to our Bureau of SAGEs over the years. So in order for this recruitment of new members to work, you also need continual training, not just the standalone training we discussed in previous webinars at the outset of your board, but the prospective member will attend a meeting, and then in each meeting or every so often, you can review particular research concepts or terminology that may be important to the research you're reviewing, whether that's comparative effectiveness research or maybe a new method. Ongoing training is essential. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, of course, sometimes we also lose members because they pass away, and it's important to take the time to reflect on that in a meeting, give members time to offer memories of who that board member was and the contributions they gave to the board before moving on. So again, when you're talking about sustainability, you want your board to be part of the culture of the provider community. So this is important because staff turnover in long-term services and supports can be quite high. So you want research advisory boards to be just something that we do here. You want strong advocates among the staff, a champion, if you will, who's the ambassador to other staff. So when that staff member may be replaced, it's assumed that the new person is also taking over their board duties. For us, this has happened multiple times, and sometimes it's a bumpy road, but we've used life enrichment staff over the years to fill that role. And this also applies to new leadership. If there's a new executive director or someone else in the leadership position, it's really important to explain the history of the board and the benefits that that board has provided to the facility and why it should remain a part of the culture of the provider identity and entity. And we've dealt with those issues as well in the Bureau of SAGEs. We've gone through 3 leadership changes since we started, and each time it's important to make the time to meet with the director so they really understand what a SAGE model research advisory board is. And finally, researchers. Even if you build it, they might not automatically come. And there's a moral imperative to make sure that researchers come so you're not having empty chairs at empty tables. We don't want to convene a group whose input isn't sought, because then the message they receive is that their voice doesn't really matter. So first of all, ask your researchers back. Jane mentioned this as well. Not only do board members want to know, but they can also tell you where they are in their research agenda, how they've used that input, and what they need input on next. and report on their results, give updates on their project, or maybe what their new project is. And also encourage those returning researchers to talk to their friends. They should be reaching out to colleagues and contacts, telling them about their experience, tweeting it, blogging about it, mentioning it at conferences. And the same goes for you. Have your elevator speech ready saying, we have this great research advisory board in our department. This is what it does. I think you could really benefit if you came and presented to them. And that it also needs to become a part of the culture of your department. So that's just something we do here, is we use our research advisory board on all new projects. So when you're assessing sustainability, there are some process evaluation questions that you can ask to see how you're doing. And it's a balance to keep to keep everything working. First of all, did the advisory board develop a mission and vision statement? This happens early on, but it's critical to sustainability because engaging members in this process can help build both the shared understanding of their role as well as affirm their commitment to the advisory board ongoing. Next, what type of advisory board structure is feasible in this setting? Part of this is what roles are members willing to take on and what roles the providers are willing to take on. Is that working? Each advisory board also develops a meeting structure and process for engagement, and partners need to be mindful of what can realistically be sustained at the provider site. For example, at Lieberman, here at CJE, nursing home members chose to meet twice every month as a group. They meet even when there isn't a researcher presenting to discuss articles and topics and concepts. But this might not be realistic in another setting where they might meet just once a month or only when a researcher is presenting. And what roles and responsibilities are realistic? The meeting structure that your board adopts has implications for roles of everyone involved as well as workload. Is it feasible to use some volunteers for some of these roles like facilitator? And being mindful of limitations and barriers such as staff and volunteer turnover. Partners can support their providers with a careful use of virtual time and in-person time. And it's not always going to be running like clockwork, but one of the things that you can do is consider what materials or guides are needed to institutionalize the processes to make the board sustainable. This applies both to an academic partner and to the LTSS provider. So for example, addressing the likelihood of turnover in members, facilitators, and other roles, boards can be more sustainable if they have guides that can be used as manuals. We have a job description for the facilitator, which can be adapted and used in different settings. And for the academic partner, there can also be processes that are institutionalized, such as every new proposal needs to go through the research advisory board. Next is how we're considering how will partnerships between providers and the research institution be maintained. These boards need the support of an organization that's familiar with the research world to help them connect to researchers and recruit researchers, and ideally administrative support within the academic center can ensure that resources and staff that there are enough resources and staff time to do the work of connecting researchers to advisory boards. For example, here at CJE, our research staff reach out to researchers, respond to requests, and provide guidelines and materials and guide them through preparing for their presentation, as well as having internal projects also presented to the board. Finally, how will participating stakeholders provide regular feedback? Jane mentioned quarterly check-ins and feedback loops, and these are really critical because research advisory boards are likely to evolve with changing memberships and conditions in the setting. So seeking ongoing feedback from everyone involved allows for adjustment and quality improvement that can really help sustain a board. For example, researchers at CJE Senior Life periodically seek feedback from bureau members as part of our regular meetings, checking in about how the conversations are going, how the input is going to researchers, and so on. So this evaluation should be ongoing and will ultimately support the sustainability of your board. And now I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'd like to introduce Erin McGaffigan, who is a Research and Policy Fellow at LeadingAge LTSS Center at UMass Boston, and the founder and director of Collective Insight. And she's going to give us more of a broader, big picture view of how all this works when we're evaluating engagement and outcomes. Erin?
Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to assume everybody can hear me unless I hear otherwise. Like Rachel had mentioned, I'm Erin McGaffigan, and I am a researcher and policy fellow at the LeadingAge LTSS Center at UMass Boston and run Collective Insight, which is a stakeholder engagement group. I'm going to talk to you. Can go ahead to the next slide. I'm going to talk to you a little bit from a couple different perspectives. One is I've done some research on effective stakeholder engagement, and I am going to walk you through a framework that I developed as a result of that work. And then I'm also going to take in some of my experience because I've been blessed to really work with the Bureau of SAGES and try to get some of these elements up in the Boston and Pennsylvania areas. So it's been, I've had my own personal experience with Bureau of SAGES, and then coming from somebody that's really just been fascinated by engagement strategies. So I am going to step back and say that we've heard a lot of great examples of engagement thoughts or things to be thinking about how to evaluate it. And I'm going to give you one of the frameworks. I know there are multiple ones out there, but one of the frameworks that from which you can look at all of these wonderful ideas around evaluation as you either get going in your own advisory board or participate in somebody else's advisory board. So I'm going to start with outcomes, right? We do stakeholder engagement, we do engaged research, we develop these advisory boards or participate in because we think that they're going to have great outcomes. And here are some examples. And we heard Jane talk about how people were actually surprised to some extent, like, wow, this is some really great information. I never would have thought of that. And so that's one of the reasons why people do engaged research. We see increased knowledge, empowerment, advocacy for improved programs, and even improved quality of life because what we hear is applied and used to change programs. On the other end, next slide, please. We also have some negative outcomes, and I don't think we should shy away from this because I think that this is some of the reasons why people tend not to do engaged research. We heard our team talk about some researchers it's hard to recruit researchers. So I think it's important to recognize that sometimes engagement doesn't go so well. People feel like it has no impact or it was unsuccessful. It required a lot of time and resources, and it maybe in some cases it even led to frustration or conflict. I bring this up not to get people not to do engagement, but for people to realize that how you do engagement and what you're evaluating, the factors that you put into engagement, the practices actually make a difference. So when people say engagement worked or it didn't work, I could probably point to a few different factors or activities or things that did or did not happen that led to those outcomes. So that's where the framework comes in. For the next slide, please. So this is what I call the pay attention framework. And the pay attention framework is my baby from the research that I've done around stakeholder engagement activities. So I was able to observe quite a few different advisory board processes, and I came to, and did literature reviews, and I came to understand what I call the pay attention framework. So this is the people and the approach and the environment matter. So stay with me for a second. The people, the approach, and the environment. We heard a lot about this today. And so I'm just going to give you the organization of it. So the people. So for the Bureau of SAGES, we heard about the people, right? We heard researchers, we heard older adults, and we heard providers. I think I heard Rachel speak to providers buying in and thinking that this isn't worth their time, especially given all of all that they've got going on in the turnover. So that we talked about the researchers really wanting to hear feedback and being ready and receptive. So these are people factors. The skill set of facilitators, being able to come in and facilitate a process. These are all people factors. So the people, their personal values, their beliefs, their experiences, their readiness for engagement makes a difference. So that's an area to think about for evaluation, right? The second one is approach. We heard Jane talk about completely changing a room with their advisory board and use of microphones. We heard the fact that Rachel's group was meeting more frequently, even if they weren't having researchers present. These are approach decisions. We hear a lot in Bureau of SAGES about providing time up front to train or educate people about what research is. These are our approach factors. These are decisions we're making that will impact whether or not our model or approach is working. The environment is the next one, right? We heard a little bit about turnover. We heard about leadership culture and whether or not leaders buy into this. We heard about people, COVID-19. I don't know, we didn't talk a great deal about it, but COVID-19 is another example, right? These are environmental factors. Whether or not a budget is allocated to engagement. These are environmental factors that will influence your success with engagement. So I would say, and that they don't all neatly fall into simple buckets. So the people will influence the approach, the environment will influence the people, right? If you have leadership that buys in, they're gonna hire people who are more likely to do engagement. If researchers are being required by funders, which is environmental, they're probably more likely to show up. These are all examples of factors that fit into these that I think have a role in the success of an advisory board. So this is where I would encourage us to think about when we think about evaluation measures to hit each one of these. Next slide, please. So what I do is just the next couple of slides is give you some things to think about for measures, okay? So we heard a lot of these already today, but when you're going to evaluate your success, ask yourself if you have some measures for the people, the approach, and the environment. So hopefully some of these are pretty low-cost ways to evaluate, and I think you already have tools from the Bureau of SAGES that do a lot of these. But for instance, the people, right? You might want to keep some counts. How many researchers are engaged? How many older adults are engaged? You can do that through simple meeting notes. We heard Jane talk about when you're moving into just a simple basic meeting note. Student interns are great for that, by the way. What about retention rates? I know that some people will leave simply because it's not for them, and older adults, and that's fine. Some people will pass away, but overall, are you seeing people show up? I think one of the things I've noticed is engagement processes that work over time. People are showing up. So are you able to retain a certain level of number of researchers and older adults in your process? Skills and knowledge. I'm not assuming everybody comes into engagement as an expert in the process, but really just recognizing that that's a factor, right? So if I don't believe that engagement's important, I'm probably not going to put a lot of time into that process. So thinking about even assessing with researchers their willingness and their confidence in engagement. Same thing with people who are facilitating. Do they have the skills? And are they ready to facilitate? And then older adults, growth in knowledge of communication strategies, research knowledge, just whether or not they value being heard. These are all factors in the people bucket that you can do through pre and post survey, as you heard from Rebecca. So thinking a little bit more about that. Approach, we heard a little bit about a satisfaction survey. I think it was Jane moving to, or maybe some sort of debrief process. Thinking about your approach, your clarity of purpose. When you meet, how frequently you're meeting, your accessibility of your meetings and materials, the actual input that's provided, and people feel like their opinions matter and that they're valued, and whether or not people feel like the facilitation or the decision making has been valuable or has been collaborative. I think that these, I lost my thought. Anyways, evaluate these, understand your purpose, see if people understand your purpose, see if people really grasp what you're trying to achieve, and look at those changes over time. And change your model based on that, which we heard Jane do. Environment, that's the last bucket, and some things to think about there. Do you have staff allocated? Can you see that in time reports? Maybe it's volunteer, and that's perfectly appropriate, but just recognizing that people or resources are allocated to the process, and how much time. We heard that Jane was talking about, trying to do that. We use our own time trackers here for our daily activities and are able to see how much time we spend on certain advisory boards. Budgeted funds for staff. Are there actually budgets? Are there funds budgeted for meeting incentives, logistics? Keeping an eye on those budgets and seeing if even you're increasing the budget allocation over time. And then recommendation application. So what I mean by that is in your meeting notes, you're actually probably documenting that what input was provided. And in doing that, you can then see 6 months down the road, or even when Jane said that, the debriefing process, did it make a difference? And being able to document in proposals, in journal articles, whatever, whether or not recommendations were actually applied. Next slide, please. So I know, I think it was Rebecca that mentioned that we don't have a lot of research, and I know there are a couple of people on this call who know and have had the conversations with us that there's just not enough research out there on engagement and its outputs and outcomes, long-term and short-term. So I'm just putting out there some areas in which we as researchers could start to maybe set a baseline and evaluate over time and impact using the pay attention framework. So for instance, can we look at journal articles and presentations at conferences over time to see if more researchers are conducting engaged research? Can we look at funders' reports about how many advisory boards do exist and how many older adults are engaged in research over time? When it comes to the approach, can we look at changes in maybe gerontology program curricula where we're seeing more discussion in classrooms around engaged research practices? Do more dissertations include engaged practices? Do more journal articles, op-eds, or even methods describe changes in engagement practices over time based on what's learned? From an environment perspective, are funders requiring engagement more often? Are they requiring budgets for engagement? Do they expect engagement to happen? And can you see that in the RFPs? Do more research audiences demand engagements, like I mentioned? So looking back to journals, are we holding each other accountable as researchers for this type of expectation? One of the things that we've noticed in our own GSA relationships is, are we engaged researchers being reviewers? Are we holding ourselves accountable as engaged research, even a priority in our research community, and how do we push that forward? And then also, looking at policy briefs. Are there themes that are coming up in our engaged research activities from the older adult perspective that we're seeing through the research is leading to change? Whether or not they have a preference for a certain style of setting or living, quality of life elements. Do we see what we're hearing in their themes actually influencing programs and services? So I think what you would find that with all the conversation that happened today, most likely the topics that were brought up, whether it be staff turnover or whether it be certain environmental leadership buy-in or a room with a microphone, those factors fall into these three categories. So I would just encourage us all to start thinking about, if it's this framework or another framework, there are a lot of similarities. How can we be consistently measuring some of these pieces of engagement so we can push forth improved methods overall? So I think that's it for me. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Erin, for giving us that sort of bigger picture conclusion of where to go from here. And also, I just want to say thank you again to Jane and to Rebecca, and for all of our participants here. We have all of our webinars, our previous webinars are on our website, and Nikki's going to drop a link in the chat, and today's webinar will be posted there in about a week. We're also putting in the chat a link to the SAGE resources. All of the ones that Rebecca mentioned and went over are also on our website. And finally, a link to our evaluation. We would really love some feedback so we can report back to PCORI about what we've learned here, what you've learned here. And also there is a $25 gift card, potentially with your name on it. We will do a drawing once we have all the evaluations in. And now I'm going to switch over to Q&A. This is my contact information if you want to have questions later on. And now we have about 10 minutes remaining, so I'm going to stop the share and open it up for questions. If there are any questions, feel free to take yourself off mute, raise your hand. Yes.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry.
sorry. Margaret, go ahead, and then we'll have Martina next. Or
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Nope.
Thank you for this. Has been so interesting and so helpful. I'm thinking about the issue of turnover and, you know, how you might even start to address it in the initial orientation or recruitment. Do you ever, when you enlist people into these activities, do you put a time limit on it? I mean, do people expect to continue on indefinitely, or do they think, okay, I'm in it for 3 months and then I can sign up again if I want?
so some of our, I can jump in, and then Jane or Rebecca or Erin can follow up. For our board, which has been ongoing since 2016, we have both members that have been there since the very beginning because they enjoy giving the feedback and enjoy participating in that group. And we have more recent members who've joined in the last 2 years, and we definitely have had members who have dropped off. I think when you get a diversity of people in your group, you're going to have also diversity of people who stay or go. And we don't really require any commitment because we understand that things can happen. Rebecca, go ahead.
Yeah, and I would add that it depends on the nature of the group you're working with and what population they represent. So for example, the Mesolim Bureau, which was made up of people recently diagnosed with dementia, that one was really designed intentionally to probably turn over, because as people progress in their illness, they're not necessarily able to continue. So I think it really depends on the setting and who's involved in your board.
And when we signed people on for this, because it was part of this sort of evaluated grant project, I think we did ask people to, please make a commitment to stay with us through the end of sort of the evaluation and the end of the sort of the pilot project. But it was a sticker for a couple of people in the initial meeting said, I just want to make sure I can get out if I just don't like it. It's like, well, of course.
And the only thing I would add to that is regarding training is think about how to make training part of your ongoing process, knowing that people are constantly changing or moving on, thinking about ways to orient people in everything you do, whether it be your meeting notes, whether it be prep sessions and before, just thinking about ways to make it part of your process.
And I'll just jump into there and then I'll let another question happen. But I think that is also the beautiful thing about having built-in ongoing refresher training that happens all the time, because we have existing members who then help mentor new members, and it becomes sort of a peer mentoring process. And that also then encourages people to remain part of the group, because it becomes more about the group than just we're here to help researchers.
Oh, I'm on mute. Thanks. Martina, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yeah, thanks for the wonderful presentations. I have a question with regard to the benefit of engagement evaluation, because I mean, the question that always comes up is also, will we do better research because of engagement? And will we be able to show that we can accomplish better outcomes on the patient side, for example? And I do know, for example, at my research institute, that's always a question that remains open. And then it's hard for to argue for the director that I need resources to implement engagement. So what are your thoughts there, or do you have any kind of experience with that kind of link? Thanks.
Did you want to go ahead, Rebecca? or-
I'll just briefly say, I think situated in an internal research department in a practice setting, we have because of our setting and the context, we have the advantage of being able to see directly how getting input impacts program related research. And so that's a beautiful thing, but that's not going to happen at all institutions. So I think that's why when Rachel talked about you need to have it be embedded in the culture of the academic institution as well, that's a long-term big process, and evaluating that is very challenging. So I would say, starting your own board, being able to evaluate the long-term impact of your board, no. But if someone were to study multiple boards, to do a study of what happens with these boards, and to interview researchers and track changes at universities, and some of the things that Erin was talking about, that those bigger picture things, I mean, you almost need a funded study to do that, to see whether or not, okay?
I'll get right on that. I would add to this, just take the meeting notes. When anybody wants me to be involved in an engaged research project, I often ask, what data sources do you already have? And you'd be surprised how much is already documented when you take meeting notes, right? So really good meeting notes over time, I feel like, including like following up and doing the debriefing, I feel like could document progress and impact in programs that most people forget because they're so wrapped up in the next project. Oh wow, those very concrete examples. I think Bureau of Sages has a lot of examples around falls and how older adults are providing recommendations that researchers just blew their mind. Jane did that. It's like, I didn't even think of that. And I think if we can get that documented, that's big. The other part of this really is about buy-in. I think that that Rebecca was talking about buy-in. It really isn't about the data. It's about the buy-in and the belief, the values that, it works, and you can provide all the data in the world. I don't value engaged research. I might not see the benefits of it. I would argue, ask every stakeholder what's in it for them, right? And there are some people that are going to be driven by funders that require it. There's going to be some people that are driven by those little examples in your meeting notes. I think I could probably point to a benefit for each stakeholder in engagement that it will also drive whether or not they take it on, if that makes any sense. For some, it's not the value of changing programs, it's the funders that require it, or the federal government that requires it, right? So stakeholder lens.
And I think also, I was just, as you were both talking, Rebecca and Erin, how the connection, right, is depending on how many researchers making that final connection, Martina, that patient outcomes are better. That's going to be several steps down the way of gathering all those things. Are we ever going to be able to show any kind of causality? Probably not. But I think the bigger the numbers, then you can say this many proposals were funded versus the ones that didn't use engagement as well.
And PCORI is doing some of that work. I'm not exactly sure how they're doing it, but they do have an evaluation effort within their institute, and they look at what's happening within projects that they fund, what kinds of research are coming out, what kinds of changes are happening as a result of that research. I'm not going to claim I know what they're doing, but I do know they do make an effort to do that.
Well, we're just about time. If anyone has one final question, we could probably handle it. Also, obviously, feel free to email me and I can pass it on to the person best suited to answer it. Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here and taking the time this afternoon and evening in Germany to join us. We really appreciate it, and have a good rest of your day.